There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that a moment of your life, one you don't even remember, could be quietly recorded, preserved in silence, and later become the only witness to your final hours. Because on a cold January night in the city of Lakewood, at precisely 2:13 in the morning, a phone resting beside a sleeping woman began recording on its own, capturing not just the faint rustle of bed sheets or the soft hum of the night, but something far more chilling. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through a space that should have been empty, followed by the creak of a door that was never meant to open, and then a voice, low and controlled, whispering words that would later haunt an entire investigation. Don't turn on the lights. By sunrise, the woman who owned that phone was dead, and the most terrifying truth of all was that the recording never revealed who had been there. In the quiet, unassuming city of Lakewood, Colorado, where life moved with a predictable calm and the distant outline of mountains offered a sense of permanence and safety, the kind of crime that would soon unfold felt almost impossible to imagine, because nothing about that community suggested danger, and nothing about Rachel Monroe's life suggested that she would become the center of a case that would leave investigators unsettled long after it was closed. Rachel Monroe was, by all accounts, a woman of structure and discipline, someone who had built her life around consistency, routine, and quiet independence, working as a content editor for a digital media company where deadlines mattered and reliability was everything. And it was precisely that reliability that first signaled that something was wrong. Because on the morning of January 22nd, when Rachel failed to show up for work and did not respond to calls or messages, the silence she left behind was not ordinary. It was alarming. The request for a welfare check came not from panic, but from instinct. The kind that develops when someone knows another person's habits well enough to recognize even the slightest deviation. And when officers arrived at her apartment complex on West Alameda Avenue, there was nothing immediately visible to suggest that they were stepping into the early stages of a homicide investigation, because the building stood as it always had, quiet and undisturbed, with no signs of urgency or disruption. When they reached Rachel's apartment door, they knocked, waited, and knocked again. But the only response they received was the echo of their own presence in the hallway. And so, with the assistance of maintenance, the door was opened, revealing an interior that seemed, at first glance, almost untouched by anything unusual, as though the night had passed without incident. The living room was orderly, the kitchen clean, and on the counter sat a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, suggesting a routine interrupted but not violently broken, while her laptop remained open on the dining table, displaying a document mid-edit, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. It was only when officers entered the bedroom that the illusion of normalcy collapsed. Rachel Monroe was lying on the floor beside her bed, her body positioned in a way that suggested neither struggle nor resistance, but something quieter, something more controlled. And although there were no visible injuries, no overturned furniture, and no signs of forced entry, there was an unmistakable finality to the stillness that surrounded her. The autopsy would later reveal that Rachel had died from asphyxiation, a method of killing that leaves behind very little in the way of visible evidence, especially when carried out with precision. And the absence of defensive wounds raised a question that would trouble investigators from the very beginning. Had she been taken by surprise, or had she, in some way, allowed her killer to come close? The apartment itself offered no immediate answers, because everything about it suggested that whoever had been there had entered and exited without disturbing the environment, leaving behind no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and no clear indication of how the crime had even been committed, which led investigators to consider a possibility far more unsettling than a break-in, that Rachel had not been alone that night, at least not in the way she believed. It was during the routine examination of her belongings that something small but significant was discovered, something that would ultimately transform the case from puzzling to deeply disturbing. Because on the bedside table, plugged into a charger, was Rachel's phone, and within it, a single voice recording that had been created at 2:13 a.m. There was no immediate explanation for why the recording existed, because Rachel was not known to use voice memos, nor had she shown any indication that she had intended to record anything that night. But when investigators played the file, the room fell silent, as though everyone present instinctively understood that what they were about to hear would matter. At first, there was almost nothing, just the faint ambient noise of a quiet room, the subtle sound of fabric shifting, perhaps from movement in bed. But then, gradually, something else emerged, something that should not have been there at all. Footsteps, slow and measured, moving within the apartment. The significance of that sound was immediate and undeniable, because Rachel lived alone, and yet the recording captured the unmistakable presence of another person. Someone who had entered her space without announcement, without hesitation, and without triggering any form of alarm. Moments later, the sound of a door creaking open could be heard, followed by a pause so heavy with tension that it felt almost intentional. And then, cutting through the silence, a voice, low, controlled, and disturbingly calm, spoke a single sentence: "Don't turn on the lights." The recording ended abruptly, and with it, any illusion that this had been anything other than a deliberate act. As investigators began to reconstruct Rachel's final hours, every detail of her day was examined with precision. From the time she left work to the groceries she purchased, to the last message she sent to a friend at 9:22 p.m., a message that contained nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at fear or concern, which only made the events of the early morning hours more difficult to comprehend. There were no signs of forced entry, no surveillance footage showing anyone entering the building, and no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious, which meant that the answer to the mystery had to lie somewhere within the structure of the building itself. The breakthrough came from an observation that, at first, seemed almost insignificant. A neighbor recalling a moment of unusual silence during the night, a stillness that had been so complete it had awakened him briefly, accompanied by the faintest suggestion of a sound, something like a whisper, though he could not be certain. That detail led investigators to reconsider the physical layout of the apartments, particularly the ventilation system that connected multiple units. And when maintenance records revealed recent work involving access panels, the focus shifted toward the possibility that the killer had not entered through a door at all. What they discovered in the vacant apartment above Rachel's was both chilling and definitive, because the air vent had been removed, and inside the ductwork were marks, scratches, fibers, and signs of movement that suggested not just access, but repeated use. The idea that someone could have been navigating the building through its ventilation system, moving silently above occupied apartments, was as disturbing as it was plausible. And when DNA evidence recovered from within the duct led to a former maintenance worker named Evan Calloway, the pieces began to align in a way that was impossible to ignore. Calloway had once known the building intimately, understood its structure, and had access to the very systems that now appeared to have been used to carry out the crime. And when investigators uncovered his history of inappropriate behavior, including entering tenant apartments without permission, the pattern became clear. His eventual confession revealed not just the act itself, but the methodical nature of his planning, because he had not chosen Rachel at random, but had observed her, learned her routine, and identified her as someone who lived alone, someone whose life could be studied without immediate detection. On the night of the crime, he entered her apartment through the vent, expecting her to be asleep. But when she moved, perhaps sensing something was wrong, he spoke the words that would later be immortalized in that recording, not as a warning, but as a command. What followed was swift and controlled, leaving behind no chaos, no visible struggle, only the quiet aftermath of a life abruptly ended. And when he left, he did so the same way he had entered, silently, invisibly, and without a trace. until the recording, until the whisper. The case, once solved, left behind a lingering unease that extended far beyond the walls of that apartment, because it forced a question that no one could easily answer. How many times had he been there before, moving through the spaces above, listening, watching, waiting, while the people below lived their lives unaware that they were not as alone as they believed? And even now, in buildings just like that one, where vents connect rooms and silence can hide the faintest of sounds, there remains a possibility that is difficult to ignore, because sometimes the most dangerous presence is not the one you can see, but the one that moves quietly, just out of reach, waiting for the moment when you reach for the light and hear a voice telling you not to turn it on.